A White House executive order directs federal agencies to identify and mitigate the financial risks of climate change. The order requires creating a government-wide strategy to combat climate risks. Corinne Dougherty is an audit partner with KPMG. She's the federal leader for environment, social, and government initiatives. Corinne, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
What are the financial risks of climate change that the executive order is trying to address?
Sure. Well, the United States government has rejoined other governments around the world towards achieving a net zero economy. And the U.S. target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is only achievable by the federal government leading the way, especially considering the size of the federal government's operations and its economic footprint. So therefore, identifying climate-related financial risks is essential for the federal government to take further action in its journey to achieve a net zero economy.
Well, sorry, Corinne, give me an example of what kind of financial risks are we talking about here?
Sure. So in thinking of the financial risks around climate change, one framework that is widely used is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. And so the TCFD discusses two types of climate risks: physical risk and transition risk. So Mimi, physical risk is the actual damage to the government's physical assets and infrastructure as a result of climate-related weather events. So Mimi, we've already seen the physical risk to the government's assets as a result of climate change. For example, military bases have had significant damage as a result of weather-related events just over the last few years. And the second type of risk is transition risk, and that's focused on what are the risks of the federal government transitioning to a net neutral economy. So for example, the government would need to look at, well, what's the cost of the government to procure renewable energy or clean energy, or replace existing assets with more energy efficient assets? And also the government will need to ask the questions, well, what are the changes in the government policies and procedures that need to happen in order to achieve a net zero economy? Climate risk is also framed around the long-term societal challenges, but there's also a number of different opportunities with transitioning to a net zero economy. And so those benefits include reducing the cost in the long term as a result of resource efficiency, and those reduced costs could fund other federal programs or mission critical needs.
So do you think that each agency should develop their own climate change response, or should this be government-wide, a combination of both?
Yeah, no, Mimi, that's a great question. And I think it's really a combination of both. But first, looking at, a specific agency, the specific agencies need to address climate change, and that could be determined by identifying and prioritizing those key climate risks that impact the agency most. And Mimi, what's really unique about the federal government is that each agency is, in a sense, its own industry. And so what we're seeing in the private sector is that each industry has a unique set of climate risks based on their operations. So correlating that to the federal government, one agency's strategy to address climate change could be very different from another. But taking those individual risks at an agency level could then consolidate up into the overall government-wide strategy to address climate change.
So what do you think, what are you recommending for agencies to do in preparing for this? Because obviously this is going to be a lot of changes and frankly, a lot of work.
Absolutely. Well, it is a monumental task, but it is absolutely something that the government can do. Well, the first step, as I mentioned before, is developing a climate risk strategy at both the government-wide level and then at each individual level. Really, the next step is where the government will need to identify, well, what are those fundamental changes in the operations in order to get to a net neutral economy? So the government can identify, well, what are the issues? What are the gaps in their processes in order to integrate those climate-related financial risks into the entity's operations? And then the next step is really developing a roadmap for how to implement the strategy across each government agency. And that takes into consideration establishing and executing the implementation plans to make sure there's appropriate resource allocation. And then the next step is just really looking at measuring progress. So what are going to be the metrics and the tools and the data sources that are going to be used to measure progress against the strategy? And then the last step is really looking at the reporting and assurance around this information. So it's really important for the federal government to be transparent in their plans to achieve their decarbonization targets. And so qualifying the potential impacts in a standardized manner, is really crucial for the federal agencies to manage their climate-related risks. So having quality disclosures on climate-related financial risk can definitely help the federal government reduce its fiscal exposure. And then taking that a step further, Mimi, is really looking at obtaining assurance over this type of reporting, which is critical to enhancing the public confidence and the accountability in the federal government in meeting its net zero target of 2050.
All right, well, Corinne, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.